everything just changed the moment those text messages surfaced. What started as a quiet legal matter has now spiraled into something no one expected, something that is shaking Hollywood to its core. And at the very center of the storm is Blake Lively, the actress known for her charm, her reputation, her grace. And now something far more controversial, because what these leaked messages suggest is control, not just influence, not just guidance, but active behind-the-scenes control over people, narratives, and decisions. And these aren't random texts either, these are detailed, timed, and according to insiders, deeply connected to how certain voices were silenced, and how some stories were shaped before they ever reached the public. And the most shocking part is how far back some of them go, before the public even knew there was a case unfolding. And suddenly this isn't just a legal story anymore, it's a power story. It's a control story. It's a Hollywood reckoning where the image we all believed may not match the actions happening in the background. And now everything is being questioned: the friendships, the media silence, the sudden statements, and the quiet disappearances. And every text brings us closer to a version of the truth that is not polished or curated, but raw, calculated, and undeniable. And that is exactly what we are about to break down: every line, every leak, every move, and every consequence, in a way that reveals what is really going on. Because the moment these messages went public, the entire game changed, and the story of Blake Lively took a turn that no one saw coming. And you are about to see exactly why the internet is absolutely shaken right now after the recent wave of development in the legal case involving Blake Lively and Justin Baldoni. But what really has everyone talking are the leaked text messages that allegedly reveal the extent of control Blake was trying to maintain behind the scenes over multiple people and situations. What started as a quiet legal disagreement has now spiraled into a public spectacle, with legal experts and media analysts diving into every detail and the public watching in disbelief. With each new development unfolding, we are starting to see a version of events that paints a completely different picture than what many expected. Because behind the perfectly curated public image, there are now signs of private efforts to steer the narrative, influence outcomes, and possibly even restrict what certain individuals were allowed to say or do. And these revelations are not just damaging, they're explosive. Insiders are calling it one of the most calculated behind-the-scenes power plays in recent Hollywood memory. And as shocking as that may sound, the emerging text messages tell a story that is hard to ignore. From the very first message that hinted at nervous anticipation to the more direct ones, where terms and expectations were being laid out, the tone shifted quickly from concern to command, and those who were once allies began to show hesitation. These texts reportedly detail how certain influencers, content creators, and even former friends were approached with what can only be described as strategic direction. Some were allegedly encouraged to post specific things, while others were urged to stay silent. And the kicker is the language used in those messages, some of which included phrases like "don't forget what we talked about," or "you know how this ends if you don't play along," which to many sounded more like warnings than reminders. And while none of these texts alone are definitive proof of wrongdoing, they paint a mosaic of control or attempted control that raises serious ethical and legal questions. What is even more complicated is that multiple people have now come forward, stating they received similar communications or witnessed them being drafted. And that consistency is starting to concern legal observers, because if a pattern can be proven, it could drastically shift the momentum of this entire case. And that's what we're seeing play out now as the case spirals in directions that no one, including the involved parties, could have expected. Even people who were initially supportive or silent are beginning to distance themselves from the situation. And it's creating this ripple effect across Hollywood, where the fear of association is now outweighing the fear of silence. The legal documents connected to the case are starting to reflect that shift too, with lawyers making subtle but pointed references to potential interference from outside parties. And that's where the text messages become more than just gossip. They become potential evidence. And for someone like Blake, who has built her entire career on being seen as graceful, strategic, and unproblematic, this narrative twist could be career-altering. And we're not just talking about reputational damage either. Because if these communications are deemed to be part of a coordinated effort to influence testimony, suppress evidence, or obstruct any part of the judicial process, the consequences could be significant. Even if no formal charges are ever brought, the stain of the allegation alone might be enough to unravel long-standing industry relationships, brand deals, and public goodwill. And what makes this all the more impactful is the fact that some of these texts date back months, even before the public knew anything was brewing, meaning there may have been a long-term plan in motion well before anything was officially filed in court. And that changes how people are interpreting everything from Blake's public statements to the timing of certain press releases, because if public perception was being managed behind the scenes while simultaneously trying to influence legal outcomes. It crosses a line that many observers believe cannot be ignored now. There's also a growing conversation about who might have been complicit in this, whether knowingly or unknowingly, because some of the names mentioned in the leaked texts are recognizable figures from Hollywood media and even the influencer world. And while many of them have not responded to requests for comment, their silence is beginning to feel louder than any statement could, and it's sparking even more questions about who knew what and when, and if any of those individuals might now find themselves entangled in the broader implications of this spiraling case. Meanwhile, public reaction continues to build, with social media buzzing around the clock. Hashtags are trending calling for transparency and accountability, and some fans who once admired Blake are now expressing disappointment or even outrage, stating that the image they supported seems to have been a performance not just on screen but in real life, and that disillusionment is spreading quickly, particularly among younger audiences who feel betrayed by what they see as manipulation not just of a legal process but of public trust. Legal analysts are also weighing in, noting that while controlling your narrative is common in Hollywood, attempting to control the behavior of others through behind-the-scenes messaging during an active case steps into dangerous territory, and that's why every single one of these texts is now under scrutiny, with digital forensics experts reportedly involved in verifying timestamps, metadata, and the origin of the messages. And if even a portion of these are authenticated, it could mark a major shift in how this case unfolds, because it suggests a level of strategic oversight that goes beyond just image management and into the realm of calculated influence. One industry insider said it best when they described the situation as a case study in how power operates behind the scenes when reputations are on the line. And what's particularly ironic is that the very attempts to control the story may end up being the thing that unravels it entirely, because courts don't operate on celebrity goodwill or curated image. They operate on evidence, timelines, and patterns, and if the texts reveal a pattern of influence or pressure, then the case might become about more than just the initial dispute. It might become about how far someone was willing to go to protect a version of reality, and what was at stake for them if that version unraveled. And that might explain the urgency behind the messages, the sudden legal filings, and the increasingly tense public silence from Blake herself, because as more people begin to speak out and more texts leak into the public domain, the story continues to spiral outward, taking with it fragments of trust, legacy, and influence. And the real question now is, how deep does this go, and what else is still hidden behind the polite smiles and carefully worded statements? Because if this is just the beginning, then the rest of the story might be far more explosive than anyone imagined. As the courtroom drama continues to spiral, public curiosity has only intensified, and at the center of it all is a series of text messages that seem to suggest a deliberate and prolonged effort to manage not just the media narrative but also the behavior of people close to the situation. And while these messages are still being authenticated and debated, what they appear to show is an individual using their influence to apply subtle yet strategic pressure on others around them. The texts range in tone from conversational to increasingly assertive, with some using phrases that suggest consequences for non-compliance and rewards for cooperation. One alleged message even reads, "Stay quiet now and it pays off later," while another warned, "This will all come back to you if you make noise." And while these may seem vague, they take on a much more serious tone when viewed within the broader timeline of events, because if these texts align with critical moments in the case or coincide with witness silence, then they might be interpreted as attempts to interfere with due process or prevent full disclosure of information. And that's where legal experts are now stepping in, analyzing not just what the messages say but when they were sent and to whom they were addressed. And the implications are growing by the day, especially as those involved are beginning to be questioned more aggressively and in more detail, with subpoenas rumored to have been issued to individuals who were previously considered non-essential to the proceedings. And that shift indicates that the legal team is now widening its scope, possibly as a response to the leaked texts and their ripple effects across the legal strategy. And from a strategic standpoint, this broadening could mean one of two things: either the case is becoming more complex than originally assumed, or there's a growing suspicion that behind-the-scenes efforts were more coordinated and impactful than expected. And in either scenario, it spells complications for Blake, because any association with attempts to limit transparency or steer witness behavior can damage both legal standing and public support. And some experts are even speculating that the strategy from her side may have been to control the damage before it began by setting up a media-friendly image early on. But if that effort was accompanied by private messaging to silence dissent or manipulate reaction, then the contrast between the public image and the private actions could not be more stark. And that duality is what's making this situation so volatile. Because fans are now reevaluating every statement, every post, and every appearance through a lens of possible calculation rather than authenticity, and that shift in perception is often more damaging than any single piece of evidence because it breeds distrust not just in the person involved, but in the institutions and networks that supported them all this time. Now another emerging layer in this drama is the involvement of third parties, some of whom are believed to be content creators, journalists, and former colleagues. And some of them are now reportedly cooperating with legal teams or at the very least preserving communications in case they are called upon to testify, and that alone changes the dynamics because it suggests that the reach of the private messages extended well beyond just a few individuals and may have touched multiple layers of the industry, from media to entertainment to legal, and that kind of reach suggests a level of strategic planning that is rare even in Hollywood, where managing your brand is part of survival. And for someone as seasoned as Blake, this level of orchestration would not be accidental, it would be intentional, it would be controlled, and it would be relentless. And what's chilling to many observers is how normalized some of the language in the texts appears to be, as if it was part of routine crisis management, rather than anything unusual or alarming. And that normalization of influence is what is now being examined, because if the industry has reached a point where coordinated silence is an acceptable strategy, then this case could become a reckoning, not just for one celebrity but for the way influence operates more broadly. And already we're seeing the early signs of that reckoning, as other names begin to emerge in the margins of this story, and as whispers turn into confirmations of who received what and when. It paints a picture of an environment where saying the wrong thing, or even asking the wrong question, could lead to being cut off professionally or personally. And that fear-based control is what is resonating with so many people online, because it mirrors stories that have circulated in other contexts about power being used not to protect but to silence. And the alleged role of text messaging in that strategy is especially alarming because of how easily it can be denied, edited, or dismissed unless documented meticulously. And that's where the digital forensic teams come in, tasked with reviewing the data integrity of the leaked messages, matching them with server logs, timestamps, and backup records. And if they succeed in verifying even a fraction of what has surfaced, then the case will likely take a very serious turn and may invite more formal investigations into the broader culture of influence within Hollywood and beyond. And that's why every message matters and every timeline is critical, because this is not just about legal wins or losses anymore. It's about the integrity of the process and the reputation of everyone involved. And at the heart of it all is a public trying to make sense of how someone they admired could be connected to such a deepening controversy. And the divide is only getting wider between those who believe there must be more to the story and those who are convinced that the texts speak for themselves. And the longer the silence from Blake continues, the more speculation builds, and the harder it becomes to control the narrative, because once trust is broken, it rarely returns fully. And that's the reality now facing not just Blake but the entire apparatus around her, because what once looked like a simple dispute has now morphed into a layered, complex case involving ethics, strategy, and reputation. And the outcome of this case may not just determine who wins legally but who survives publicly. In an era where perception is everything and control is now being examined like never before. And the next few weeks are likely to be decisive, not just in the courtroom, but in the court of public opinion, because as more communications emerge and more people speak out, this case will continue to grow in scale and impact, and whatever happens next is guaranteed to shape the way Hollywood handles influence, crisis, and communication for a long time to come. As the leaked messages continue to circulate, the conversation has shifted from initial disbelief to urgent inquiry, and now even those who were initially skeptical are beginning to acknowledge that there may be more truth to the narrative than previously thought, because the consistency in tone, timing, and recipient overlap across multiple sources suggests a level of credibility that is hard to ignore. The messages have now become the central thread connecting various elements of the ongoing legal and public fallout, and it is that thread that is being pulled apart by journalists, investigators, and internet sleuths, all racing to understand how deeply the influence extended and what it might mean for the broader picture being painted in courtrooms and media outlets alike. What is emerging is a timeline that appears to track efforts to maintain control over certain aspects of the unfolding story, particularly around who was allowed to speak, how they were allowed to frame their narrative and what consequences might follow if they deviated from the expectations. Allegedly set out in those messages, and while none of these claims have yet been proven in court, the optics are damaging enough to cause a significant shift in the perception of Blake and her circle, and that shift is being felt across entertainment media and online platforms where the previously unwavering support has begun to waver. Under the weight of the growing controversy, one of the most disturbing elements of the text messages is their strategic nature, with some allegedly coordinating responses to media requests, timing of social media posts, and even legal decisions. And that level of coordination, if confirmed, may not only challenge the credibility of certain testimonies but could also raise serious ethical questions about manipulation of process and narrative, and that is why legal analysts are closely watching what comes next, because depending on the authentication and admissibility of these texts in court, the consequences could range from evidentiary adjustments to broader legal implications around obstruction or interference. And for the general public, the emotional response has been overwhelming, not because these things have never happened before, but because they are now being documented and exposed in real time. And the emotional toll on those who may have been coerced, misled, or pressured through these communications is becoming part of the story too, with some recipients of the text allegedly stepping forward to share their experience and provide context to the messages now being dissected. And that context is vital because it paints a fuller picture of the environment in which these messages were received and how they may have affected choices that later influenced the case. And that is why the legal teams involved are now requesting access to a broader set of digital records, including backup devices, cloud accounts, and communication logs from third-party apps, because the belief is growing that what has surfaced so far is only a portion of a much wider strategy. And that possibility is raising alarm bells in legal circles, especially if any of the content reveals discussions that may have crossed legal or ethical lines, even unintentionally. And as more pieces of the puzzle fall into place, the narrative becomes harder to control for those involved, because once the messages are in the hands of analysts, lawyers, and the public, the ability to spin them disappears, and all that remains is their content, their tone, and their timing. And it is those three elements that are now being scrutinized most intensely, because they reveal intention, coordination, and urgency. And intention is perhaps the most important factor, because if it can be shown that the messages were part of a deliberate effort to manage or manipulate the narrative, then the entire strategy may backfire in court and in public perception. And the timing of the messages is also becoming a focal point, with some aligning closely with pivotal moments in the case, such as the filing of legal motions, the release of public statements, or the appearances of certain individuals at key events. And if those alignments are more than coincidence, they could suggest a level of orchestration that challenges the foundational assumptions of the case. And that is precisely what the opposing legal team appears to be arguing now, by pointing to patterns within the communications that suggest a unified plan. And while none of this proves guilt, it does raise serious questions about the integrity of the process and the role of influence in shaping outcomes. And that brings us to one of the most uncomfortable parts of the story, which is how influence operates quietly behind the scenes, often unnoticed until it is too late. And the idea that someone admired and celebrated could be involved in such efforts is deeply unsettling for fans, supporters, and even industry peers. And that unsettling feeling is what is driving the outrage online, as well as the quiet concern within the entertainment industry, because no one wants to be associated with a scandal that suggests manipulation, coercion, or control. And already we are seeing brands distancing themselves subtly from the narrative, with pauses on collaborations, delays in media appearances, and a noticeable absence of public endorsements. And that corporate distancing, while often unspoken, speaks volumes about the way reputation functions in a media-saturated environment. Because once credibility is questioned, the fallout is swift and far-reaching. And it is not just limited to Blake either, as other individuals mentioned in the text are beginning to feel the pressure too, with some facing difficult questions from their own audiences, employers, and legal teams. And that ripple effect is what turns a controversy into a crisis, because it expands the scope of impact and transforms the case from a singular dispute into a wider industry moment. And that is exactly what is happening now, as this situation becomes a mirror reflecting not just one person's choices, but a system that may have enabled or even encouraged those choices for years. And in that reflection, people are beginning to ask larger questions about the culture of silence and control that often underpins high-profile conflicts. And those questions are making it harder for anyone to remain neutral because the story is now bigger than its original headlines, and as that story grows, the demand for truth, transparency, and accountability only gets louder with every leaked message, every reluctant witness, and every legal twist that enters the public eye. And in the face of that pressure, silence becomes a strategy and a risk. And for Blake, that silence is becoming harder to maintain without appearing complicit or evasive. And the longer it stretches, the more the public is left to interpret the story on their own, with the texts as their primary source of evidence. And interpretation in the absence of context often leads to judgment, and that is the space. We are now in a space where public opinion is being shaped by fragments of communication that suggest a narrative of control, power, and fear, and whether or not that narrative is entirely accurate is almost secondary, because perception is now leading the charge. And as legal teams rush to get ahead of that perception with filings, clarifications, and strategic leaks, the public remains focused on the messages themselves. The words that were written, the timing of their delivery, and the possible impact they may have had on people, decisions, and outcomes. And in that spotlight, every character in the story is being scrutinized with a new intensity. And that scrutiny is unlikely to fade anytime soon, especially as more developments are expected in the coming days that could either confirm or challenge the current direction of the narrative. And for now, all eyes remain fixed on the digital trail that started as a leak and has now become the core of a spiraling case with consequences that are still unfolding. What began as whispers has now become a wave, a digital trail of messages that has rewritten everything we thought we knew about this case and about the people at the center of it. Especially Blake Lively, once seen as untouchable, untarnished, now pulled into a spotlight she never expected, and a narrative that refuses to be silenced, because these messages are more than just conversations. They are clues. They are pieces of a larger puzzle, and that puzzle is painting a picture that is making everyone from fans to industry insiders to legal analysts ask the same question: how deep does this really go? And the truth is, we still don't know, because with every new message, with every reluctant voice that speaks out, with every connection uncovered, the story gets wider, the lines get blurrier, and the consequences grow heavier. And what we are witnessing now is not just a legal unraveling, it is a public one, a reputational one, a reminder that in an era of receipts and records, even the most carefully crafted image can fracture under the weight of exposure. And as the case spirals further and more names get pulled in, the stakes only climb higher. Because this is no longer just about one person or one lawsuit. This is about how power moves, and how it hides, and how sometimes it all comes crashing down. No matter how protected it once seemed, the questions will keep coming, the court will keep looking, and the world will keep watching, because the messages are out there and they cannot be unseen. And the silence around them will only grow louder until the truth in full is finally revealed.